chair of the philosophy department and professor at San Jose State, and we have served on the ICOOC Animal Care and Use Committee together for about 57 years.
It feels like a long time. Yeah.
For quite a few years, and she was chair of that committee for a session.
A term, whatever. Yeah.
And she came to San Jose State in the fall 2002. She is a classic overachiever. She earned her BA in chemistry and philosophy from Wellesley College, and thinking she wanted to be a chemist. Love chemists. She got her PhD in physical chemistry at Stanford, and then she realized that she was kept up at night not in questions of chemistry, but in questions of how humans, with our limited sensory apparatus and our comfortable biases, can manage to build reasonably reliable knowledge about the world. So it wasn't so much the chemistry, but the human construct around the chemistry that kept her up. So she went back to Stanford to get a PhD, and with a focus on history and philosophy of science. And so her current research focuses on places where scientific knowledge building and ethics are intertwined, which is pretty much anywhere you do science, I would hope.
I think so.
This encompasses not just practices within the scientific community that lead to better knowledge, but also the broader question of how scientists and non-scientists can do a better job sharing the world with each other. So, she's active in writing. She's written for Forbes, Scientific American, and science blogs. She's always tweeting and posting.
I don't tweet in my sleep.
What's that?
I don't tweet in my sleep.
Don't tweet in your sleep. So anyway, welcome Janice Stemwedel, and I will let you introduce.
Will you dim the light at the top?
no.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for having me here. What are those? There we go. Okay, so that you'll be able to see. So what I'm going to be talking about today is not necessarily at first glance a story where you think, aha, this is a story about responsible conduct of research or about ethics. But it's one of those places where some of the stuff scientists are doing to share our world with other scientists, to do the knowledge building and the training of new scientists, sort of collides with the places where scientists are sharing a world with non-scientists in interesting ways. And I think thinking about some of that overlap, how, scientists are not all confined to science islands, segregated from the rest of the world. Scientists walk among us. So that leads to some interesting things for scientists to think about when sometimes they're not. So where we're going to start is a story about a kid who won third place in her school's science fair. This is Lauren Arrington, who in fall of 2012 was a sixth grader in Jupiter, Florida. And she did a science fair project looking at the lowest salinity that she could measure that lionfish could tolerate. So this is, kind of a cool science fair project for a sixth grader because Florida, they are noticing lionfish invasions on the coastline, and there's this river system connected to the coastline, and they're thinking about, could lionfish get even more invasive? So she had an interesting project. She had an interesting, at least a plausibly good strategy for a sixth grader to study it. She kept 6 lionfish in tanks, and for all but the controls, she gradually added fresh water to the salt water that they started out in and reduced the concentration of salt and observed the behavior of the lionfish. And what she ended up concluding for her IACUC-approved science fair project is that lionfish displayed normal behavior even at a salt level of 6 parts per thousand, which is not much more saline than fresh water. Okay, so this was good enough to win her third place in her science fair. And none of us might have heard about it except for the fact that a year later, a paper was published in the journal Environmental Biology of Fishes that reports pretty much the same conclusion that Lauren Arrington came to, that invasive lionfish can tolerate very low salinity. And in that paper, there was an acknowledgement, and this is the part that's kind of cool, that, where did it go? Lauren Arrington of King's Academy, West Palm Beach, Florida, conducted preliminary laboratory experiments that helped give rise to our experimental design. So she gets an acknowledgement in a published scientific paper, and her school, very savvy, puts out a press release on the school website saying, hey, look, one of the kids who won third prize in our science fair is being acknowledged in an international scientific journal. This caught the attention of the media and gave rise to some headlines, started close to home and spread outward. So the Palm Beach Post said, Girls Science Project nets international recognition. NPR's headline was, 6th graders science fair finding shocks ecologists. I actually talked to some ecologists, they were not shocked. But you know headlines. CBS had the headline, 6th grader credited with scientific breakthrough. So pretty cool for Lauren Arrington and her science fair project. Meanwhile, on Facebook, this is the first author of that paper that acknowledged Lauren Arrington. This is Zach Judd, who, when the news was breaking about this cool breakthrough from a 6th grader, was a recently graduated PhD. He was not mentioned in the news stories, and so he put up a post on his Facebook expressing his frustrations at the narrative that was playing out in the media coverage. So here's his post of July 21st, 2014. My lionfish research is going viral, but my name has been intentionally left out of the stories, replaced by the name of the 12-year-old daughter of my former supervisor's best friend. The little girl did a science fair project based on my previously published discovery of lionfish living in low salinity habitats. The story's been picked up, has received almost 90,000 likes on Facebook, yet my years of groundbreaking work are being completely and intentionally ignored. At this stage in my career, this type of national exposure would be invaluable if only my name was included in the stories. I feel like my hands are tied. Anything I say will come off as an attempt to steal a little girl's thunder, but it's unethical for her and her father to continue to claim the discovery of lionfish in estuaries as her own. Okay, this is strong language, but he's talking to his friends on Facebook, right? Who among us has not maybe said things on Facebook that we wanted to walk back eventually? Well, he goes on in this post, I'm looking towards you, my valued friends and colleagues, for suggestions on how I might be able to remedy this intentional misrepresentation without doing anything to disparage the little girl. Too late. Most of you are aware of the massive amount of time I put into exposing kids to science, and I obviously don't want to do anything to diminish this young lady's curiosity or enthusiasm. I'm thrilled that she chose to look at lionfish for her science fair project, but encouraging an outright lie is poor parenting, that gauntlet thrown, and a horrible way to introduce a youngster to a career in the sciences. This picture was taken in 2010 when I first discovered lionfish occupying estuarine habitats 3 years before the little girl's discovery. Notice, if you will, whoops, how many shares? More than 2,000 shares. Most of those racked up within the first week after he posted it. Okay. Well, as you might imagine, who could have seen it coming on Facebook? In the comments, things escalated a little bit. So he mentions, okay, now there's a petition on the web demanding that the young lady be added as an author on my most recent scientific publication because apparently I stole her idea. That's how it's being portrayed. The little girl's science fair project gives scientists great new idea. Give me a break. I was nice enough to include her in the acknowledgments section. Pretty big deal for a 12-year-old girl. Of course, the petition doesn't even list my name as the author of the paper because none of the news stories mention me, just my supervisor who didn't do any of the research. Okay. His Facebook friends pile on a little bit. That's plagiarism, they say. Go get her. You've got to do something. I already contacted her dad, who I know well, and very delicately voiced my concerns, Zach Judd writes. He told me they're more interested in hearing from a real professor, not a grad student, even though he knew I had my PhD and that it was 100% my research. Next comment from one of Zach Judd's friends, probably not necessarily going to help. What a butthead. Lawyer up. Okay, so we're getting some additional stuff from Zach Judd and his Facebook friends that isn't apparent in the story. One of the things we find out is that Lauren Arrington is not just a unconnected sixth grader, or unconnected at the time that she's doing the science fair project, that in fact her dad is a scientist. Her dad is Aubrey Arrington, who was the executive director of the Loxahatchee River District, running the facility that had the tanks where Lauren did her science fair project. We learned that Papa Arrington was a collaborator of Craig Lehman, who was the thesis advisor, the boss of Zach Judd while he was a graduate student. We learned that there's maybe at least a difference of opinion being kicked around here about what kind of contribution people made to the project at various states, to either Lauren's project or to Zach Judd's project and his published work. We also seem to be seeing different strategies for communicating about the science with the broader public that might be interested in it. We at least, see the suggestion that the public is not going to care so much about the scientific finding if it's attached to a boring grown-up scientist as if it's attached to, a young, eager kid who we can kind of relate to more. The public can relate more to a 12-year-old kid than they can relate to you all, is one of the things we're getting. And if they're going to, hear from a scientist, they want to hear from a real scientist, not a recent PhD. All right. So, worth noting, just if we're trying to keep track of who's on first, what's on second, this is a paper that came out in 2011 before Lauren started her science fair work, which was in 2012, that first off does report lionfish being found in freshwater estuaries, with Zach Judd as first author, Craig Lehman, his advisor, as second author, and they're sitting in fourth author position is Aubrey Arrington, right? So, among other things, this means that Zach Judd has good reason to believe that Aubrey Arrington knows that Judd found out something about lionfish being in places that might not be terribly salty before Lauren had her idea for her science fair project. So there's, Back to Facebook, where things are still blowing up. This is still the same day that the post originally went up. Sorry, Zach, I know getting exposure is so important now with how hard it is to find a job. Hopefully Craig and Florida International University will help you to do PR. Zach said, Craig took all the credit and associated himself with North Carolina State, which is where he had just moved to, not Florida International University where all the research was done. I just can't believe he would throw me under the bus like this. Some of the most relevant research I've ever done, and I'm intentionally getting no recognition. You get the sense that Zach Judd thinks that, maybe there's some intention in leaving him out here, since he keeps using the word intentionally and phrases like being thrown under the bus. One of his Facebook friends, I think, tries to be the voice of reason and says, let's think about this. You're sort of trying to deploy us on your behalf. Is it possible that saying something here might not help you any? So she writes, what an uncomfortable situation to be in. This is one of the worst things that could happen to a scientist, and I'm really sorry. However, I think at this point, the media is interested in the story of the girl, regardless of the discovery. So even if you try to voice your concerns, it's not worth it for them to go back and correct their mistake, because to them, the story loses its charm. Thankfully, you published your results, and they are there for anyone who wants to look it up. This will blow over in a few weeks. Well, I want to tell you it didn't blow over in a few weeks, because the story went viral again. And it took an interesting twist. Instead of being, here's a cool finding about an invasive species and, oh, look, a kid figured it out for a science fair, now it's a different story. It's a story about, was the research hijacked by the 12-year-old? IO9, sixth grader may have stolen credit for marine biologist's lionfish research. Boing Boing had a headline, too, that originally had the word plagiarism in it, and then they reeled it back and said, okay, here's the new headline. Sixth graders' internet-famous science project misleadingly promoted as new, which is actually one of the more nuanced online headlines I've seen. So now we've got people still paying attention, but they're not paying attention anymore to cool scientific finding that we can make palatable by wrapping in the attractive package of a sixth grader. We've now got this question of, is the sixth grader evil? Is the sixth grader stealing from scientists? And then it shifts one more time. So the next round of headlines after the ones raising questions about whether the sixth grader did something bad is now, well, we've got a fight. So let's not think about, the lionfish invasion anymore. Let's not think about, is the sixth grader bad anymore. Let's look at scientists fighting about something. So the Washington Post headline is, breakthrough sixth grade science project at the center of a fight over scientific glory. The Blaze had the headline, why a scientist is now attacking a 13-year-old science fair research is unethical. The Louisiana State University ichthyology blog has the headline, media pumps up a little girl's science project, then viciously takes her down, leave this kid alone. And what's nice about this is they focus on the fight, and they assign blame where every researcher wants to assign blame, which is the media, right? So there's plenty of blame here to go around, though, and it's still being dished out on Zach Judd's Facebook wall, where someone comments, I don't believe that this is about plagiarism. The girl didn't steal Zach's data and pass it off as her own at school. She did a mini experiment that went around along with the research he was doing. The real issue here isn't what the little girl is doing. It's what her father and Dr. Lehman have failed to do, straighten out the facts in these misleading articles. and continuing to allow the credit to be placed in the wrong hands. It's also what the media outlets have done, failing to check facts and present the truth. So I posted my opinions on the NPR site, but they were promptly removed, so, you know, I'm posting here. I'm going to amplify it where I can if those bastards at NPR keep taking my comment down. This is the subtext. Judd ends up on his Facebook wall, but it gets quoted, and this is another interesting thing that it's not clear that Zach Judd was aware of beforehand. We're in an age where if a reporter can't get you on the phone, if you've made public comments on social media, that's like an on-the-record statement. So the Central Florida Aquarium Society quotes Zach Judd as saying about a particular article, one of the first articles actually on the Science Fair project before it goes viral, regarding an article on Society for Science written by Bethany Brookshire. Judd explained, that article mentions me only because I spoke directly to the author. I actually got Brookshire in touch with the little girl for an interview, but she still twisted the story and made it sound like I was unaware of the issue until after the Science Fair project. I gave her the accurate story, but after interviewing the girl and her dad, the story partially reverted back to its incorrect form. Judd continues, I already contacted the little girl's dad, who I know well, and very delicately voiced my concerns. That should sound familiar because that was on one of the comments on his Facebook wall that I showed you, taking that as an on-the-record comment. Although fully aware that Judd had his PhD and that the research was 100% Judd's, we haven't really asked Craig Lehman about that, but we'll get to that. Aubrey allegedly responded, they're more interested in hearing from a real professor, not a grad student. Okay, so, you know, throwing another gauntlet. We haven't run out of gauntlets. We're throwing them all down. During like a 3-day period, as this is escalating and the story is mutating into something different from what it started out as, Craig Lehman is really, really quiet. Really quiet. He's being accused on Zach Judd's Facebook wall of throwing him under the bus, of intentionally cutting him out, and he's just hanging back. And then finally, he updates his blog and posts a timeline with these sort of understated headlines, just because people keep asking. And some of those people are reporters. So he goes through and he says, I really didn't want to be involved in this argument, but people keep asking, and so I'm going to tell you how I see it. And he presents a timeline. So some salient details from the timeline to help get us clear on one of the issues that Zach Judd is really exercised about, which is who is getting credit for his work? Is he being, you know, cheated of appropriate credit or not? Lehman makes it clear that he and Zach Judd make the first discovery of lionfish in an estuary in that region and estimate the salinity of the estuary back in October of 2010. They get it published in June of 2011. Anna Lauren Arrington starts her, that's not quite a reasonable date back there, starts her Science Fair project in September of 2012. She wraps it up in December of 2012. So that's after the initial discovery in the wild of lionfish, someplace you'd be surprised to see them. After Lauren Arrington's Science Fair project, Zach Judd conducts his own lab salinity experiments in the summer of 2013. His experimental design, somewhat more sophisticated than the 6th grade Science Fair project experimental design, but he's doing his work after Lauren does hers in terms of in the lab, how low can we take the salinity without affecting the behavior of the lionfish. So with this timeline, Lehman also says something about why he went quiet, about why he wasn't jumping in to correct the record. He says, sometime in May, I was contacted by King's Academy, Lauren's school. They had seen that Lauren was acknowledged in this published paper, and they wanted to ask some questions to put together that press release that they put on the school website. And Lehman says, I assume that that press release led to the June inquiries I received from the Palm Beach Post and the Florida Sun-Sentinel that also put out articles. I was not happy with the way I was quoted in these early articles, so after those, I fielded only sporadic questions here and there from media outlets. I have declined or ignored many, many interview requests since. So he sort of said, I didn't like the initial coverage, so I decided I was done with the media. I have been mentioned in many articles, stories, posts that have not named Zach explicitly. This has not stemmed from any deliberate attempt to exclude Zach. I always do everything I can to promote students' research programs. And Lehman, of course, you know, as a good researcher, is going to put blame where he thinks it goes. And again, that's with the media. But is it a surprise that the media hyped up a story about a 12-year-old that made a finding that was cited in a scientific paper? And that it just happens to be a finding regarding the environmental issue, invasive lionfish, that may already be the most overhyped environmental issue in this part of the world. I am more shocked by those who are shocked that the media would sensationalize such a story. Also, there were many erroneous details included in articles, stories, posts. Are we surprised about that? Also not surprising, this is common when media outlets translate basic science to the public. Okay. So, I'm not telling you this story to present you with a scientists hate each other when they get mad about the credit or they get mad at the media. This isn't, a soap opera for the sake of a soap opera. This is actually, I think at its heart, a story about the responsible conduct of science. And it's an interesting story because it has interlocking layers here. It tells us something, if we look at it, about interactions within the scientific community that didn't really go as well as they could have here. And these are interactions between scientists around both knowledge building and keeping score about who built that knowledge and who deserved credit for it. It's also a story that shows us some interesting things about interactions between scientists and the public. So we'll start with the easy stuff. The scientific knowledge building end of things, where scientists are working with each other to build accurate accounts of observations, experiments, and where the ideas come from, is the kind of thing that scientists will say if you ask them, yes, these should be reflected in our scientific reports. Our scientific reports should get the details right of who did what when, of who learned what when. And part of that is going to be reflected not just in our description of our methods or our observations. Part of that has got to be reflected in an accurate author line and an accurate set of acknowledgments. So we shouldn't be listing someone as an author who hasn't actually contributed whatever it is that we agree an author contributes to get in the author line. We shouldn't be acknowledging someone for a contribution that, in fact, they didn't really make. That makes us creative writers, not scientists writing about our results. So, arguably from this, we could take a look at the claim that Zach Judd made in the heat of the moment that Craig Lehman contributed nothing to the research, that was 100% Judd's. And you could say, well, but you reported it in an article where Craig Lehman is the second author, or the article where Lauren Arrington is acknowledged, where Craig Lehman is the third author. So if you're including him as an author, that suggests either he contributed something to the research or someone's lying. Right? So you got to figure out which of those it is. The paper where Aubrey Arrington is the fourth author. Yeah, did he contribute something to the research really, or was he a courtesy author? I don't know the answer to that question, but what's behind the answer to that question may be connected to some of the interactions, some of the dynamics between Zach Judd and his advisor, Craig Lehman, and Craig Lehman's best friend, Aubrey Arrington. So there's an argument going on that Zach Judd thinks is really important about credit for his finding, and of course he thinks it's important because he's trying to get a permanent job with his PhD. Right? He wants people to look at the work he's done and say, that's really important. And he notices something that looks like his work that people out in the wider world are saying is important in news outlets, but his name isn't part of it. So scientists, generally when they're trying to sort out who gets scientific credit, aren't looking at what's being covered on CBS News, right? They're looking at the author line. And so that's supposed to be where people who are deciding whether to give you grant money or whether to offer you a job can look and sort of judge how much you contributed or how much you didn't. Especially for early career scientists who don't have a lot of other kinds of power or connection within the scientific community. If you can't take the papers you've authored and leverage them into more grant money or permanent positions, you kind of feel powerless. Of course, sometimes senior scientists will say, but science is this meritocracy, right? It's very flat. There's not power, really. We're all contributing knowledge and ideas and trying out people's ideas and trying to knock them down and find the problems with them. What's all this about power? Well, of course, the people with less power in the community can tell you where the power is because they don't have it. They want to have it. So there is power in who controls the grant money, who controls the facilities, right? Who controls access to the research facilities in the Loxahatchee River District, and which sixth graders get to use those facilities for their science fair projects, for example. Institutional affiliation, and whether it's permanent or temporary, that's a kind of power too. Social capital within the scientific community, who your advisor tells the reporter who's asked for comment to talk to if they're not available. Is it going to be you or is it going to be their pal? Access to the press is itself a kind of power. Power is one of those things that can be used for good or can be used for evil. It can be something that you can control very precisely or sometimes can get away from you. Zach Judd was in a tricky place because this popular press coverage made it feel to him like the world was going to believe this kid built the knowledge that he had built. And it felt to him like that was maybe going to undercut his attempts to get a job on the other side of his graduate training. And at the very least, it would dilute his credit if people really believed the hype that he got the idea from a 12-year-old. And what's probably, a more significant worry, although I'm not sure that Zach Judd judged it as such, was the fact that his advisor was silent about his contribution while Lauren Arrington is getting all this press. Maybe kind of conveyed to people, perhaps, that Zach Judd was applying for jobs with, that his advisor didn't have his back. That would actually be a concerning kind of thing if your advisor isn't standing up for you in a professional setting where you ought to be stood up for. There's another kind of power that this story illustrates that I think is a relatively new thing within the scientific community and within the larger project of scientists sharing a world with everyone else, and that's the power of social media. And this is a place where early career scientists maybe have an edge just because of having grown up when some of these tools were new. while the people training them to be scientists were busy doing what they were supposed to be doing, which is, doing the research and then playing Tetris on the side rather than updating their Facebook. We saw Zach Judd put up a Facebook post sort of mobilizing his friends, and it got more than 2,000 shares. That's huge. That is big amplification of his message. The problem is he amplified a message that maybe was not as reflective as it was sort of ranty. Sort of, here's how I'm feeling, and what I really need is your emotional support. His friends didn't just give him emotional support there. They also left angry comments all over the internet, all over the news sites. And that's what got his name into the story, but not the story he wanted his name to get into. So this was power that I don't think Zach Judd thought hard about, and it was not easy for him to control. It led to amplification of the explicit charge that Lauren Arrington had lied or committed plagiarism, that Aubrey Arrington was, Machiavellian or a butthead or some combination of those. And the abusive comments from Judd's supporters on news articles probably didn't do him too many favors within his professional community. So you'll remember that Zach Judd singled out a particular journalist by name as someone who twisted the story. Well, as it turns out, one of the side effects for him of singling out that journalist by name and making the claim that she got it wrong required him to offer a public apology. Because in fact, he had spoken to Bethany Brookshire before the story went viral. He had made some choices about how he was going to present the story of his own research connected to Lauren Arrington's science fair project, and she kept her notes. In his original discussion with Bethany Brookshire about Lauren Arrington's science fair project and how it connected to his own research back before the whole story went viral the first time, he says, I didn't want to say anything that would have taken away from the interesting story of a young lady doing neat science, particularly in an article geared specifically towards student scientists. As a result, my statements to Bethany may have inadvertently led the reader to think that Lauren's role in my scientific research was larger than it actually was. So he was, in some ways he was doing the news coverage equivalent of giving Lauren not just an acknowledgement, but almost a guest authorship, or an acknowledgement of something bigger than she actually did. And it was only once the story went viral that he decided that this was a bad call and had regrets. And, again, rather than being reflective and thinking, how could that journalist have gotten the wrong idea about this, decided that it must have been intentional. So scientists have obligations to each other, clearly, as they're building knowledge. They want to build knowledge reporting accurate observations, giving accurate accounts of what conditions they use to make those observations. They want to make accurate claims about who should get credit for what. But arguably, scientists sharing a world with everyone else also have some responsibilities to the public. One of those, I think most scientists believe, especially scientists working with public funding, is that they have a responsibility to share knowledge that they've built, that it could be useful to the public to understand more about their world, to understand some of the things that scientists have come to know. And since public funds help to build it, keeping that knowledge within team science would kind of be ripping the public off, and that would be bad. There might be I think there probably is arguably a responsibility to make sure they're not just dumping knowledge on the public without making sure it's getting understood, but to make sure that the knowledge is being communicated accurately. Okay. So that the public has a sense, in terms the public can understand, of why the knowledge matters, of what it means, what it adds up to. Now here's just a fact of how things are right now. A lot of science is being communicated not directly by scientists. A lot of scientists aren't the ones communicating the knowledge they've built to the public. And there's a couple reasons for that. One reason for that is that's not usually one of the things that plays a big role in your job evaluations, in whether you get grant money, and it's not nearly as important as getting lots of scientific publications. That's where the real scorekeeping is, right? And scientists are smart. You put the effort where you're going to get the biggest return in terms of the score that's being kept that ensures whether you get to keep doing science. Another reason scientists often don't communicate directly with the public is there's not usually a big component of our scientific training that tells us how, that helps us understand how talking about our science with non-scientists is different, and how they're not necessarily going to understand it if we get what I like to call at cocktail parties the spinach dip blow-off, where people ask you, so what is it you do? And the scientist starts describing their research, and the person's eyes glaze over, and then they say, oh, is that spinach dip over there? And they move on, right? Why? Because there's no part of our scientific socialization that really trains us how to communicate directly with the public about what we're doing and why it matters. So scientists, a lot of times, either because they're really busy or they just don't have the skill set that's well developed and ready at hand to communicate with the public, they lean on science journalists, which can be great, because journalists, just to do the journalism thing right, need to know something about how to communicate with the public, how to get the public's attention, how to get them to read past the first paragraph of a story, how to absorb important information from the story even if they don't read past the first paragraph. It's challenging, because although there are some science journalists that have scientific backgrounds, and Bethany Brookshire is actually a scientific journalist who does have a scientific background, but a lot of science journalists don't. They have J-school backgrounds, so they don't usually understand the science as well as the scientists. So they're trying to communicate to the public about something that they don't understand as well as the people who made that knowledge but don't know how to communicate it to the public. They also, if they're trying to understand the thing they're reporting on, they're usually focused on understanding the details of the science, of the finding, of the research that went into building that finding. They don't spend as much time thinking about the scorekeeping between scientists and how much credit for a finding is going to mean to a brand new PhD like Zach Judd. And they're going to have, and they're going to defend their different perspectives on why a story matters. So they might say, yeah, invasive species, that matters, but it also matters to tell this story about the science that a kid could set up an experiment to find some of this stuff out. So science journalists doing this work of being a bridge to help the scientists fulfill their duty to the public of communicating the knowledge, arguably that's going to set up maybe scientists having some obligations to the journalists. I put a question mark here because each of these is something that I can imagine scientists arguing against, either strongly or at least a little bit. I think the first one is a no-brainer. There is an obligation, if you're depending on journalists to communicate your science to the public, not to lie to them, not to deceive them. We then get to the question of, does that mean there's a duty not to spin the story? And then we get into the question of, is spin deception, or is it me just emphasizing the thing I think is important or interesting? I think that's a place where maybe the scientists and the journalists should have a discussion. Is there a positive duty if scientists as a group are relying on journalists to communicate their science to the public, for them to help journalists? If journalists are calling for comments, should a scientist be saying yes more than they say no? Is that something where they ought to be, they ought to tag in another scientist? It's worth noting, and we saw already, journalists won't necessarily not write the story if they can't get you to specifically answer their questions on the phone or by email. They'll see what you've said in public. They'll use that. And Facebook is public now. Do scientists have a duty to set the record straight if they think the journalists have gotten the story wrong? Craig Lehman said, I stopped talking to the media because I wasn't happy with how I was quoted in those first couple stories. So I just said, okay, done. And that's an understandable impulse, but the consequence is not just for the journalist. Consequences for what the public understands, and the consequence might touch people in your scientific community, either in terms of misrepresenting the knowledge they built or misrepresenting their role in the building of it and the credit they deserve for it. So I think there's some lessons here that are really useful ones for scientists to draw, especially in a world where scientists are interacting with the public at large and also with members of the media who are sometimes their bridge to the public. One thing scientists need to understand is the better story from the point of view of what gets clicks or what sells papers may not be the more accurate one or the more fair one. So they have to really keep that in mind and figure out what they can do to mitigate it. The story can shift. It's not the case that the public is wedded to having a story that tells them something they needed to know about, lionfish or about ecosystems or about climate change. They'll watch a fight if that's what the story is. That'll get clicks too. That might get more clicks. Another lesson that I think Zach Judd has learned is misrepresenting facts to the journalist and then saying she twisted the story can actually make things worse by making it clear that you were the one misrepresenting the facts. Journalists will point out that scientists are not the only knowledge builders on the block. Journalists are trying to build knowledge too. Journalists have ethical standards too that are connected with getting accurate stories. So good journalists, and of course there are bad journalists out there, but guess what? There are bad scientists out there too. Good journalists will strive to get the facts, and they will strive to be objective. And just like scientists keep lab records, so do journalists. They keep their notes. They rely on the honesty of their sources in the same way that scientists rely on the accuracy of their measuring devices, right? A scientist who's lying to a journalist is like a broken measuring device from the point of view of the journalist trying to build an accurate story. They just can't get the story right if the source misrepresents the facts, even if that misrepresentation of facts is driven by the best of intentions. I don't want to steal this little girl's fire. I want to put her at the center of the story. I'm going to puff that up. That kind of thing leads to problems downstream, as Zach Judd discovered. So this is, an interesting set of stories that unfolded in the real world that I found fascinating because of the interlocking layers that it sort of opened up for inspection. It sort of displayed in a way that even members of the public could start to put together that there's both cooperation and competition among scientists. The public understanding of both of those things is probably not as strong as it could be. And scientists sometimes forget that, especially when their cooperation and competition, and especially their competition when it's not going happily, spills over into public view. So what the public understands about science is a subject of a whole different area of research where how much the public understands about particular findings and why they matter is up for grabs. It's something we'd like to increase, but it's hard to do that. What I try to teach in my philosophy of science classes is, people who are not science majors, I want to understand the process the scientists use to build the knowledge. That's something that maybe would help the public understand where these facts that get reported come from, rather than thinking they're just being delivered by the oracle of science. Something else the public is maybe trying to understand that scientists think should be beside the point, but for the public really isn't, is what scientists are like as people. And what the public understands makes a difference to scientists. What the public understands is going to play some role in how willing the public is to put public funds behind scientific research and scientific training. What the public understands about science is going to play a role in how willing they are to trust scientific findings of various sorts, especially in areas of scientific research that have been politicized. What the public understands about science is going to play a role in how willing they are to trust scientists as people. And in some ways, that's the piece that is probably the place to start to get the public more science-friendly. It's not to sit them down and make them a flow chart of the scientific method and remind them of all the stuff they should have learned in junior high about science that they've proceeded to remove from their brains. It's to start them with the idea that scientists are people like they are. They're relatable human beings. There was a way in which what unfolded on Facebook here was relatable, but unfortunately in sort of a reality show kind of way, rather than these are people I want to hang out with. But we could flip that script if scientists could be out to their communities as scientists and be relatable and trustworthy. Sort of the big take-home, of course, is it's never a good thing, or almost never a good thing, when the story shifts from what the scientific finding is to here's a bunch of scientists fighting with each other. And the fight was probably avoidable if the co-authors of the various projects and the collaborators and the people being acknowledged had a plan up front about not only how to share the credit in the scientific literature, but how to communicate what each of them did if the popular press got interested. So I don't know if there's a mechanism for me to leave these slides, but if there is, I will, because in case you're interested in digging deeper into the details, I've identified a few of the best, I think, posts that sort of collect what was happening and why it matters. And thank you. I think there's time for questions. Yeah.
This is totally not let out, so I'm probably going to tackle this. But so there was that situation where lying happened. So publicly, professionally, where do you go from there when the media outlet is kind of trying to do its job, and there is kind of this shift where some journalists really aren't doing their jobs. They just aren't.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating. And one of the first rules is have three sources. But that's not kind of possible when you're doing a science story because there's usually only one person that knows the research. So where do you go from there, and then what do you do? What's the best thing to do after when you realize, wow, there is a scientist that lies, and I can't trust that person?
Right, yeah, I can tell you, knowing a bunch of science journalists, that when they identify a scientist who lies, they do not ask that scientist for comment again. Unless it's a story about how they've had to retract a bunch of papers because they made stuff up. And then they'll ask them questions, in the attempt to get them to lie some more in a way that's easy to prove. So lying, as a scientist, lying to journalists is the absolute worst thing to do. You just don't want to do it. Bethany Brookshire, had talked to Lauren Arrington about her science fair project, had talked to Zach Judd about how it fit in with his research, and he made the mistake of sort of playing up what Lauren did and making it look like it might have inspired some of what he did. She also talked to Craig Lehman. I don't know that she talked to Papa Arrington or not. But, it seems like other human beings, these scientists talking to journalists may have had things they wanted to accomplish, right? They wanted to make a kid look good, whether that kid was a young person that they were trying to inspire to do science because they saw themselves as not only, someone learning to be a scientist, but someone learning to do public engagement with science too, or they, wanted to make their daughter look good because people do that, or they wanted to stay out of it because they didn't want to, be in a fight between their best friend and their advisee. So, yeah, journalists are going to have to weigh, people are saying slightly different things. What are the facts I can get them to agree on? The problem here is what Zach just said fit with what, the other outlets were saying too, that Lauren Arrington had believed in more than she actually had done. And that, sort of once he realized his mistake, once the story went viral, probably the way to minimize the damage would have been to say, okay, I spoke to this outlet that is aimed specifically at kids in school learning about science, and I made the mistake of, when talking about what Lauren did, sort of underplaying the part that I did that was different from that. And I could see how that would be misleading, and it's my bad. And instead, he kind of lost his jump coming up. The reporter, and it's just how it works.
It's curious how, in this particular instance, the reporter, the journalist, initially didn't have an agenda, whereas now you can see all these journalists and news outlets that have some sort of agenda. Mm-hmm. And so how
well, and a lot of the agenda at this point, honestly, because no one knows how to make journalism commercially viable. The agenda seems to be whatever we've got needs to attract readers, it needs to attract clicks, because otherwise we're doomed. This is a sinking ship. So whatever the story is, they don't want to tell you lies, but they also want to tell it in a way that's going to attract an audience. And telling it in a way that is, something that 12 scientists will think, yes, that's exactly the right way to tell it. Maybe that's something you can do if you run a specialist peer-reviewed journal. But you can't do that if you're writing for a commercial